Hey there, Mr. Usher here. I'm doing a recorded lesson for you guys here. This one is a little outdated, but it does cover a lesson that some of you are going to be curious about, which is the lesson we did on Friday, May 13th for the full credit class. That was on, as the title says here, addiction and substance abuse, right? So this is something that we often think of as just a personal problem, something that people deal with, but it is in fact a psychological issue and, more importantly, a mental health issue, right? So that's why I wanted, people to kind of dig into that a little bit. So first things first, the din. The din, as I had kind of led up to for the whole week prior to this, right, was all based on the reading that I asked you guys to do, where there were some issues with that. I'm working with Mr. Carter to get that fixed. But yeah, the reading was something I asked you guys to do. I offered to print out copies for you. So if you still need that, if you're still having issues with that, just let me know. I can get you a copy, that kind of a thing. Basically, the din is just a few multiple choice questions on that. If you read the reading thoroughly, you should have no problem with it. Okay, for the next one, there was a video, right? Actually, two video clips. I'm going to show you the link to one. I didn't include the whole one here because we only watched a tiny portion of the clip. But what I would recommend if you're genuinely curious, let's find it here, is to search up this video. So this clip happens to come from one of my favorite TV shows currently on the air, Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. Probably notice a certain similarity, right, to him and I would say, in terms of, the nerdiness and the interest in getting things, factually accurate and that kind of a thing. But in any case, there's a particular episode on rehabs. You probably heard the term rehab, short for rehabilitation, which is a place where somebody goes to work on issues that they have with drugs or alcohol, right? So what I'm going to ask you guys to do for this, it's not going to play the sound for this, but I will play part of it. Very basically, you'll want to watch up until about 1 minute 15 seconds, right? So watch the first minute and 15 seconds. That should kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Basically, it gives you an idea of what our attitude towards drug and alcohol addiction was really through the 80s and most of the 90s, to be honest. And then very gradually, from the late 90s on, that started to change, right? Until we eventually got more to this point, right? So if you watch this video, Susan's Brain, it takes a more scientific, a more neurological approach to addiction. It talks about what's actually going on in your brain when a substance, is starting to create an addiction in you, right? Basically watch that video, kind of learn a little bit about that. It actually deals specifically with opioid abuse, so, think about that. It was that portion, the two videos there. We had a Kahoot that we didn't really run actually in most of the classes, to be honest. If you're genuinely curious about it, I can send you a link to it. Otherwise, don't worry about it. It's not going to be graded. It was just something I thought would be fun to do on a Friday for students, but so many of them were gone that it didn't really work out. Anyway, after that, I tried to squeeze in some time to have people practice their skits. Most students didn't take me up on it, but I thought, hey, since this is the last day of class before I'm having people present, maybe try to rehearse here, right? Work out some kinks. And then there was a ticket out the door. The ticket out the door basically asks you to reflect on some different approaches to addiction, right? So what I'm going to do is actually show you some of the parts of the reading to hopefully help you understand these approaches that I'm talking about, right? So of course there was kind of the old school approach, as is mentioned in the Last Week Tonight video, right? Again, it's this one, Rehab, Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, HBO. Pretty easy to find on YouTube. This old school approach was the idea that it's just pure willpower. It's right, well, you want to quit drugs? Just say no, right? That's it. There was literally a slogan that former First Lady Nancy Reagan used. She was the wife, of course, of former President Ronald Reagan. And one of the big things that she focused on was anti-drug campaigns, right? And her whole thing was just say no, right? If somebody offers you drugs, just say no to them. If you're addicted to drugs, just stop using them. It kind of made it that simple, but the science suggests it's not nearly that simple. So, anyway, let me go to our faithful textbook here. Go to the textbook, we'll find that under the clinical psychology chapter, right, there is a subsection for substance abuse or substance use disorders. Give that a second to load. And that was kind of the section that I asked you guys to read. So there are kinks with that, obviously, but that was the section I asked you guys to read. So hopefully we can get that to load. Okay, so you have this under psychological disorders, right? Go towards the end of this, we find substance-related and addictive disorders. So let's go there. And we get here. Now, very basically what I want to break down, because this is what I'm asking you in the den, what I want to break down is what the difference is between a so-called biological approach versus a social approach, right? So it talks a little bit, right, about this biological approach to addiction here. Basically, what it's arguing here is that a lot of addiction is due to biological markers, due to imbalances in neurochemicals, due to the wiring of our brains, the connections between our neurons, and our genetics, right? And so because of these things, certain people are just predisposed to addiction, and it's inherently difficult, if not impossible, for them to use a particular substance responsibly or in moderation, right? This is often the case for alcoholism, which we know to be very, very genetic in nature. It's not the only thing that causes people to have a substance abuse disorder with alcohol, but genes definitely play a large role. As this kind of says, right, what we basically have is this approach that suggests that the actual chemicals in our body are interacting with the chemicals in, the chemicals in the substance are interacting with the chemicals in our body, often replacing chemicals like dopamine, which triggers pleasure, and leading us to a point where essentially our body becomes dependent on that substance, right? What essentially happens according to this model, and we do have evidence for this, as we can kind of see here, normal brains will produce these certain amounts of dopamine, which is necessary for reward and pleasure, right? If we didn't have any dopamine, we wouldn't feel motivated to do much of anything, right? And so what happens, right, is that if we abuse a substance for long enough, right, in this case, cocaine was a substance being used by this individual, the cocaine eventually kind of comes in and replaces the dopamine in our receptors, right, filling in these blanks, essentially, and kind of taking over the role of dopamine. And then the body basically says, oh, well, this guy's kind of taking this over. I guess we'll stop producing so much dopamine, right? We can just chill, right? And the problem with that is, right, your body then becomes dependent on this external source of pleasure and reward, right? And so if you just don't have cocaine to use, you're in a bad position. That's where the addiction kind of comes in. You have an intense craving. If you don't get it for long enough, you go into withdrawal, which can be physically painful, even potentially fatal. So, yeah, there's definitely some evidence for the biological model, right? Here Robert Downey Jr. Would often describe his early issues with addiction as being, I think, biological-like, almost as though like he just could not stop using these substances, right? But of course, there's another approach as well, this learning approach, or social learning model, basically arguing that we kind of develop patterns of behavior by learning them from older people in our environment, right? Or adopting certain cultural norms into our behavior. So they have 4 major points here that I'm going to go over really quick. 1, addiction patterns vary according to cultural practices. This is absolutely true. Well, what they point out here is that there are a spectrum of different cultures when it comes to something like alcohol, right? So on one end of the spectrum, say over here, you have cultures that actually are relatively comfortable with alcohol throughout the lifespan. They even actually allow for children, or at least like older children, to have small amounts of alcohol during certain dinners or during religious ceremonies, right? And then on the other hand, they also look very, very poorly at alcoholism, right? So in these cultures, they mentioned, for example, like Italy, Greece, France, being an alcoholic is very, very taboo. If you're drunk in public, that's like a no-no. Do not do that, right? On the other end, right, we have these cultures that say absolutely no youngins with the alcohol, right? It's a bad thing that shouldn't be done, right? Of course, there are exceptions that are made. People often turn a blind eye. But generally, it's like, no, this is a bad thing. It's against the law. You shouldn't be doing it. And then on the other hand, oddly enough, like it's considered okay or acceptable to be at least somewhat drunk in public. It's even used as an excuse to like shoo away behavior. What we find is that these cultures, but not these cultures, right? The cultures that kind of have no to the youth, but yes to the adults, versus yes to the youth, but kind of moderate for the adults. These cultures, right, are the ones that have more problems with alcoholism by far, right? So that's a cultural factor to think about. Policies of total abstinence tend to increase rates of addiction rather than reduce them, right? So having this kind of just say no approach tends not to work for most people, at least for people who have actual addiction issues. So what we find is that kind of just saying no, just telling the person not to do this, largely doesn't work because there's so many cultural stimulants around them to kind of affect that, right? There is even some evidence, as it points out here, that during Prohibition, certain rates of alcoholism were increased. It says, Prohibition reduced rates of drinking overall, but it increased rates of alcoholism among those who did drink. So overall, the average number of drinking went down, but if you look at each individual person who did drink, they drank significantly more than they would have otherwise, right? They were kind of binging because they couldn't normally get this stuff, right? Not all addicts have withdrawal symptoms when they stop taking a drug. This is actually a little odd, right? Because the biological model pretty clearly suggests that if you do develop a genuine addiction and then you suddenly are cut off, that will lead to withdrawal. But there have been some notable cases where that did not happen, right? Most notably, right, there was this big worry that a lot of soldiers in the Vietnam War who were doing heroin while they were over in Vietnam would come back to the U.S. after the war and they would have huge withdrawal symptoms because they couldn't get as much heroin over here in the States. But it largely didn't happen, at least to people who came back to loving, caring families. For people who did not have that support network, yeah, there actually was some real issues with heroin addiction. But having that love and support and care and social framework to support you actually brought you to a place where it's like, yeah, I don't really feel like I need this. Like, this isn't good for me, It was mostly that environment, that social environment of being with these soldiers and kind of doing this euphoric kind of drug to kind of relieve the psychological pain of this horrible, horrible war we fought. That actually drove this. And once you weren't in that situation anymore, you could get better, you could adjust to normal life, and yeah, heroin wasn't that important to you. Finally, addiction does not depend on the properties of the drug alone, but also on the reasons for taking it, right? So there are certain things like nicotine in cigarettes, or other kinds of stimulants like cocaine, or caffeine, right, where they stimulate parts of our body that actually cause particular chemical reactions. But there are other factors that we know kind of make that a problem, right? The difference between problem drinking and non-problematic drinking has to do with whether or not you use the drinking, the alcohol, to kind of be a substitute for your problem, whether or not you're self-medicating, as we say, right? If you're dealing with serious depression and anxiety, and you decide, well, I could go to a therapist, or I could just get blackout drunk, that's probably a problematic drinking. If you're like, well, I'm going to go to a therapist, I'm going to take medication if they recommend it, but also I'll have a beer or two every now and then, right? That's probably not problematic drinking, right? So these kind of social decisions that you make are also important. And those are basically the two approaches, right? So when you're answering the ticket out the door, compare this biological approach, which talks about the chemicals, the neurons, that kind of a thing, to the learning approach, which talks about your culture, your upbringing, that kind of a thing. Compare and contrast. Anyway, that's basically it. If you have questions, please see me. But yeah, that's it for now. Have a good one.